homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. I am out here in my greenhouse. It is 27th of April, and I'm getting ready to start my melons, my summer squash, so zucchini and patty pan squash, and a few cucumbers. And I thought I would do a continuation of a 4-part series that I've been doing on why aren't my seedlings thriving? Why didn't my seeds come up? And the first part was on temperature and how important temperature is and how often it gets ignored and forgotten about when people are talking about starting seeds and starting seedlings or taking care of seedlings. And today I'm going to talk about the second thing that I think mostly gets taken for granted, and that is soil. When we say soil, we're talking about whatever the medium is that the plant is growing in. And most people are under the impression that if you're starting seeds, you need seed starting soil. And you can get away without using seed starting soil. You can just sift regular potting soil and sift out the big chunks. The main reason for seed starting soil is, one, it's a sterile medium, which honestly, I don't really think it is, because it's not going to stay sterile in the bag through all the shipping and everything that it goes through. So that's kind of a misnomer unless you re-sterilize it on your own once you get it. And then secondly, it's just very, very fine. Like the roots, when you think about how tiny a broccoli seed is or a tomato seed is, that's interesting. There's a nail in my compost. When those roots are first emerging from the seed, they're very fine. They often call them thread stage, and they don't have a lot of strength to push past a big chunk of rock or a big piece of bark. And so seed starting mix, the main reason for seed starting mix is just that it's been filtered so that it's very soft and loose and easy for the seeds to penetrate. But the thing that you should know about seed starting mix is that it doesn't usually contain any nutrition at all. So there's no actual fertilizer in that mix. And seeds have enough energy in their individual packets of stored energy that they're able to usually come up and grow their first cotyledons, so their first kind of seeds that aren't their true seeds. And then if there's no nutrition in that soil, they're really going to struggle, because plants don't just need sunlight in order to grow. They are magical. They can take sun and turn it into actual plant matter, but they need some other building blocks in order to do that. And that is, they need nitrogen, they need phosphorus, and they need potassium. And those are NPK, is what those are abbreviated as. And if you've ever picked up a bag of fertilizer and you've seen 3 numbers on the bag that just is like a number, a dash, a number, and a number of dash, that is NPK. And so it's required on fertilizers that they indicate what percentage each one of those nutrients are in there. Generally, if it's very high, you can burn your plants. And so stuff like 20-20-20 is just going to fry the roots of things. We tend to want to buy something that we think of as balanced. And so you'll see balanced fertilizers for sale that say things like 10-10-10 on the bag. But the reality is plants don't actually use those nutrients in equal amounts. They typically use 3 times nitrogen, 1 time phosphorus, or the middle number, I always can get confused about whether it's phosphorus or potassium, and then 2 of the third one. And so the number ideally should be some ratio of 3-1-2. So 3 parts nitrogen and then 2 or 1 and 2. So that might mean it says 6-2-4. It might mean that it says 9-3-6. But it should be some ratio of those 3 numbers in an ideal world. And that's a general rule. Different plants will use slightly different ratios depending on the plant itself and how much vegetative growth it has. Those different things contribute to the different parts of the plant and how it grows. And so you need some stuff for green growth. You need some things to set fruit and seed. You need some stuff for good root development. And so having a good ratio of that helps. You need to have some kind of soil nutrition in order for your plants to continue to grow. And I see a picture posted on social media where somebody simply says, I planted these tomato seeds and they came up and they still look like this and it's 3 weeks, 4 weeks later. That is almost always an indication that there isn't enough nutrition in the soil or there's no nutrition in the soil. It's really important that you have some kind of fertilizer in there. I make my own seed starting mix. There's a blog post and I actually have a video on this that I made last year. And so I make my own seed starting mix and I add a homemade organic fertilizer directly to that seed starting mix so that the plants have some nutrition from the very, very beginning. I don't think you need to have sterilized soil unless you live in a crazy humid environment where you have a known pathogen that's been a problem. And so I'm not a big believer in trying to sterilize everything. There are funguses and bacteria in the air all the time, on your skin, on containers, and the things are only going to stay sterilized for a few seconds, and then they're going to be recontaminated by the environment. And so I would much rather add a little bit of really good compost to my seed starting mix and have the good bacteria and fungus that are in that compost inoculate that soil and outcompete any of the bad guys than I would have a sterilized soil mix. So I went through that when I first started gardening. I would put big things of soil in the oven and cook it and blah, blah, blah. And I finally realized, one, it was a huge hassle, and two, it was kind of pointless because I wasn't really suffering from any major problems. But adding some kind of fertilizer to your soil, or if you're using a sterile seed starting mix, as soon as you start getting those true leaves coming out, you want to add some fertilizer to your soil. The easiest way to do that, if you haven't mixed it in from the beginning, is simply to get a liquid fertilizer. Neptune's Harvest is often recommended. It's a fish meal fertilizer. It's very stinky, so be aware of that, but it's a good general purpose fertilizer. And when the plants are really, really tiny, you can burn their roots if this fertilizer is too strong. And so it's often suggested that when they're really small, you use it at a half of the normal dilution. So you just mix twice as much water in as what the label calls for and water your plants with that. But soil nutrition is really, really important. That goes true for things in the greenhouse. This particular soil medium that I'm using, I actually buy this in big totes from a friend of mine who has a big organic tomato farm and nursery. And so I just buy a big tote from her because I do a lot of commercial starts in the spring. This has an organic fertilizer already in it. And so I don't have to worry too much about adding additional stuff. But if I wait too long, basically the nutrition that's in the soil starts to run out over time. And so if I've got some things that have been in pots for 8 weeks, you kind of start to, one, they're starting to get root bound because they've just got too much plant matter for the size of the pot. But two, they're running out of nutrition and you need to add more. That's very true also of plants that are in pots. So if you've got a green stalk, or if you're growing your vegetable seedlings in 5-gallon pots or buckets or whatever, every time you water, that nutrition is getting pushed out through the bottom of that pot, and there's no worms or other things that are going to help recycle it and move it back up into the layers so that the plant can use it. You need to keep adding nutrition to your soil if you're gardening in pots. If you're in a regular garden, generally adding compost or mulch to the surface of the soil is going to slowly break down over time and feed the roots of that plant. And so if you get the balance right, you don't have to do a whole lot of additional nutrition once things get established if you've got some good compost in there to begin with. But really important, our acronym was moisture, temperature, light, and soil. And so we've talked about temperature. In this video, we're talking about soil. Soil nutrition, critical. Plants don't just magically manage to grow in a sterile medium. They need something to help build the building blocks of their cells in order for them to grow. So nutrition in the soil, very important. Don't forget about it. And I have a blog post on making your own fertilizer if you want to make your own organic fertilizer, or you can just buy a good brand of organic fertilizer. Organic fertilizers are often quite slow release compared to the commercial Miracle-Gro and stuff like that. And so it helps if you add them from the very beginning. It might take a while for you to see results otherwise. All right, I'm gonna get to planting some of these melons. You'll notice I'm not using seed starting mix for these melons. These seeds are big enough that they are gonna be able to push out through this soil even though it hasn't been sifted. So for large seeded things that you might want to start ahead of time, you can use just regular potting mix and things are going to be fine. And so that includes things like squash and cucumbers and melons. I have a lot of interesting melons this year. We did a seed swap in February and there were a bunch of interesting melons left over at the end. And so I decided I was just gonna do a grow out of all these different melons that I've never grown before. Try them all out. I normally only grow cantaloupe because I like the fact that cantaloupes do what's called a slip when they're ripe. They come right off the vine. And so they're ripe, there's no debating or questioning. I'm not a fan of things where you can't really tell, but we're gonna give this one a shot this year. Some of these, it's gonna be hard to tell. I do find that most things, there is a very distinct color change and also a scent change when they're ripe. And so hopefully I'll be able to tell. Maybe we'll do a video late in the summer with a taste test of all the different kinds of melons that I'm growing this year. So I have a Charentius, which is an Italian variety. I've got something called Tommy Apple from Baker Creek. I have Matika Samara from Baker Creek. I have Small Persian from Baker Creek. These were all from the seed swap. And then my standby that I grow every year is called Hannah's Choice. I really love this and I grow a lot of these. And then I have a Arava Gilia, which is a green cantaloupe, somewhat similar to a honeydew, but in my opinion, much better flavor. So I grow a few of these every year. They are a lot softer skinned, and so I find they're prone to damage from things like pill bugs and earwigs where they've been resting on the ground. So I don't grow a lot of these, but I really love the flavor. So we'll do a couple of these as well. So most melon and squash need about a ½ an inch of depth in terms of the seed. This soil is really fluffy and I haven't watered it, so it's gonna sink a little bit when I do. So a ½ an inch is about the length of that first knuckle. So I'm gonna go a little bit less than that just because I know these are gonna sink down a bit when the stuff gets watered. And I have tried sometimes like putting them pointy end down. I'm not gonna bother with that today. Some of these have 3 in a pot. Some of them have 4, depending on how much I was determined to make sure stuff came up. And sometimes I leave things in a hill of 2 or 3 when I plant them out, and sometimes I thin them. And then in the very end here, these are a tobacco, an actual smoking tobacco. I don't smoke, I don't plan on smoking that tobacco. But a friend from the seed swap gave me the seed for that. I'm mostly just really curious to see what the plant looks like. Tobacco is one of the big foundations of this country in terms of the crop that was being sent back to Europe. And I'm really curious, and it's a big part of the South, even though I'm not in the South. And so I'm just curious what it looks like. And so I thought I would grow it. I've grown Nicotina, which is related. It's an ornamental, and I've grown that off and on for years, and it reseeds a little bit, so I always have it around in my garden. But it'll be fun to see what actual tobacco plants look like. So that's just a fun experiment this year. And then the zucchini that I grow, that I've mentioned in a million videos, is called Costata romanesca, and it is an Italian variety. And I find that it is fairly resistant to bug pressure. We do not have squash vine borers in the western part of the US, and so I don't have to deal with that, but we have plenty of squash bugs. And it seems to be pretty resistant to the damage that squash bugs can do. In fact, they don't even seem to like it. I rarely actually even see a squash bug on the plant, which is amazing. And I love the zucchini. I find it is firmer and better flavored than a typical black zucchini that you grow or the zucchini you buy at the store. I'm not a huge zucchini person, but I really do love this variety, and it has changed my view on zucchini in general. All right, these two I did water ahead of time because those seeds are basically smaller than a piece of granular pepper. I'm gonna put a little bit of vermiculite over the tobacco. I'm not sure if it needs light to germinate. I'll need to look that up. If it does, I probably just covered it all up. Everything else is not gonna really need it. These guys are pretty tough. You can direct seed everything in here, with the exception of the tobacco. I don't really know how that works because it's new to me, but I find I get much better germination and the plants are in better shape if I start them in pots and then plant them out, but they do not like to be in pots for very long, which is why I'm doing this so late in the season. 27th of April, our last frost date here is around Mother's Day. in terms of when the soil is warm enough to really start planting things out. And so I'm only going to have these in pots for a week or two before I plant them out, just enough to make sure that they've germinated well. They do not like to be in pots for long. As soon as they're root bound, they will stunt. A couple of those seeds floated up there, so I want to make sure that they get buried. I find that when I direct seed, and I've done that quite a bit, I have problems with slugs and other insects eating the seed before the plants get a chance to really get going, or I've had birds just peck them out of the ground. And so I like to give them the protection of the greenhouse for the first little bit of time. And these seeds only have enough energy to kind of break the surface of the soil. And so if they're too deep, you run the risk of them basically running out of energy before they're able to get to the surface and start photosynthesizing. And so you don't want them too deep. It's tricky. Which is why I put 2 or 3 seeds in each pot, because that way they end up at different levels and some are deeper than others. They still have a good chance, at least of 1 seed in a pot coming up. All right, you guys, that's all I have on soil. I'm gonna write an in-depth blog post on all of this at some point. I've got a lot of ideas on this, but the biggest thing I just wanted you guys to understand is plants don't magically grow without some nutrition. And so you really need to be cognizant of what the nutrition is in your soil and give them some fertilizer, and ideally get a soil test, but that's a whole different subject that we're not going to talk about today, so that they can get off to their best start. And I generally aim for 10 to 12 parts nitrogen, and then the other aspects accordingly in terms of that ratio that we already talked about, that 3-1-2. But I like about 12 parts of nitrogen, and blood meal and feather meal, which are both considered organic, are 12 parts nitrogen. So that's a good one in terms of nitrogen. And nitrogen is usually the thing most lacking in home soils. So it's important to make sure that you've got a good amount of nitrogen in there. All right, I will update you on these as they start to germinate. Thank you for watching. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment and share. Let me know how your garden seed starting is going. I'm in zone 7A. Last frost date is around the first week in May. We'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.